And one other organisation that you'll all be familiar with is obviously CND. Okay? And we've got a speaker now, a lady called Dr. Rebecca Johnson, who I'm going to zoom in. This is Dr. Rebecca Johnson. She's part of the ICANN steering group that won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. She's also the CND Vice President. But Rebecca's going to talk to us about a subject that I cannot believe has not been spoken about in the UK before in a public forum. And that is about British nuclear testing in the Nevada desert and a tribe called the Shoshone tribe, whose lands were taken away from them to be used for testing. So we know, obviously from a British perspective, about Australia and the lands that were taken away. We know, obviously, the Marshallese on the Marshall Islands, the Gilbertese and Christmas Island, but not lots has been said about the Shoshone tribe. So I'm going to bring her in, so if you just bear with me for 2 seconds, I will bring her in. I'm hoping she's going to be able to see me.
Hello? Is that on?
Rebecca, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear or see me?
We can see you, and just to say, we've got an audience of people here. I know you can only see me because my camera's here, but we do have an audience of people, and you're on about a 25-foot screen.
Oh, well, okay, so I should think about starting whenever you're ready for me to do so.
We're ready for you right now. I've introduced you, so we're ready to go.
Okay, well, thank you very much for organising this meeting, which I think is incredibly important. I'm sorry I've not heard what anyone else has said, so I hope I don't repeat, but what I was asked to look at is particularly looking at the UK nuclear weapons testing programme and responsibilities for Indigenous survivors and environmental remediation. I gather there's others speaking about the Pacific Islands and Maralinga, but I can do that if not. And so I was going to focus on the Western Shoshone lands, but can I just check, have you got other people speaking about Pacific Islands?
Yes, we have, yeah. If you can concentrate on the Shoshone, that would be fantastic.
Great, okay. Well, so the first thing to really remind everybody about is that there have been over 900 nuclear weapons tests carried out on what is known as the Nevada test site, which is part of the ancestral land of the Western Shoshone Nation, particularly the western band of the Shoshone Nation in the United States. And just to remind what that means, the effects and impacts of the nuclear explosions involve the blast with the heat and the flash, the radiation fallout from the mushroom clouds, and all those environmental effects which are quite synergistic, also causing problems with crops and so on. So, and also the knowledge that we now know that ionizing radiation from nuclear production and testing disproportionately affect women and girls and the reproductive and genetic health of future generations. So the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, I don't know if you can see, I'm holding it up, as well as establishing obligations and responsibilities for states that join the treaty, the Nuclear Ban Treaty, the TPNW's prohibitions and provisions apply to non-state entities. They provide a more effective disarmament toolbox for people all over the world in the nuclear-armed and also in the nuclear-free countries to exert ethical, financial, political, normative, humanitarian and practical pressures. And it is important, therefore, to recognise that even though the UK has said so far that it's not going to sign this treaty, it is absolutely appropriate for us as civil society to be using the treaty to highlight the violations of human rights, of the land, the environment, and the health of peoples who have been harmed by UK nuclear testing, and in fact by nuclear testing by all the nuclear armed states. And this is specifically in the treaty under Article 6, which relates to positive obligations on victim assistance and environmental remediation, and on Article 7, which relates to international cooperation. And I'm just going to say a tiny word about those two. Basically, as with all treaties, the UK is not directly required to implement a treaty that it has not signed. But as we know from almost every treaty, going right back to the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which had a lot of influence, particularly on France, which never signed it, because it was recognised by the rest of the world once it had entered into international legal force. So Article 6 of the TPNW puts victim assistance and environmental remediation solidly into its obligations, and requires that states that have been affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons to assist the survivors, and recognising the importance of age and gender-sensitive assistance without discrimination, including medical care, rehabilitation and psychological support. Now, that's an obligation on states that join the treaty, and it addresses the environmental remediation as well as the health and other kinds of support for the survivors. But under Article 7, this requires that all states that join the treaty, but also is very much taken as meaning an obligation on civil society to really be raising these issues, because it enshrines the right to seek and receive assistance from others, and it contains also a legal obligation on, and again this reply goes directly to states parties, but by extension we as citizens of the UK take on this obligation to ourselves as part of our responsibility as citizens. And there is a legal obligation on all states to cooperate with each other in facilitating the implementation. So we are really, under these, it's very important to be raising, and for cities that join the ICANN appeal, and through other kinds of civil society means, to really be arguing for our country, our government, and in all ways possible to provide technical, material, humanitarian and financial assistance. So coming directly then to the nuclear tests carried out in Nevada. So 24 of the 45 nuclear weapons tests that were carried out by the UK, most of which were carried out in the Pacific and on Maralinga, on Aboriginal lands on Australia, with a collaboration with the agreement of the Australian government, but not the agreement of the people living on the land or the Aboriginal communities. So, and in the same light, but by 1961, the US had invited the UK to use the US Nevada test site, which, without having in any way got the permission or agreement of the people who lived on the area known as Noah Segovia. And if I had PowerPoint, I would show this to you. But Noah Segovia is the name given to that land from thousands and thousands of years ago by the Shoshone people, and the western band of the Shoshone Nation particularly lives in that. And when you look at the Most of this land is in Nevada, but quite a bit of it is in California, and also spreads across to Utah and even a bit of Idaho. Now, all of that land was agreed on in the 1963 Ruby Valley Treaty between the then government of the United States and the leaders, the elders, speaking on behalf of the Western Shoshone people. This was a treaty was made that gave the Western Band of the Shoshone people the rights, the possession, the rights to use. They have a culture that pays great attention to both the sacredness of the land, the rocks, the water is incredibly important to them, obviously being a large part of it being desert land. To live there, to graze their horses, to grow food, to farm, basically to live and use the land, and with their culture have an incredibly close connection to, to the land and to stewarding, to the stewardship and the, and the sustainability of the land. And a group of us from Greenham Common back in 1990 did an action. We got ticked off about a nuclear test in 1991, and together with Greenpeace, and I was one of the organisers of this, 3 Green women, together with a guide from American Peace Test, hiked to ground zero and actually halted that nuclear test for some hours. It took place then on a subsequent day. It was very dangerous. They were, the 4 who hiked there were incredibly courageous, and did manage to stop that test, and as I say, were arrested. And through that, Greenham women took on learning much more about the whole land rights issue and the human rights violations that Britain collaborated with in carrying out those, its nuclear testing there. So we carried on raising awareness. We had some women from the Western Shoshone people come over to the UK in the early 90s and do a speaking tour. And then at the time when the UK was trying to overturn the US moratorium of 1992 to 93, that was paving the way for there to be the negotiations on a comprehensive nuclear test ban. 13 of us from Greenham Common did an action of actually going over the wall and into Buckingham Palace during the garden party with placards with information about all 24 nuclear tests that had been carried out in violation of Western Shoshone sovereignty, health and environment. And following on from that, we've really kept up contact with them, and this year, or last year actually, 2021, for the 40th anniversary, we had a seminar from Ian Zabate, who now is known as the principal man of the Western bands of the Shoshone Nation of Indians in the fight for true sovereignty and justice. And that is the group that is working on those connections, following on the work of women such as the Dan sisters, Corbin Harney and Bill Rossi, Senior, who actually came and spoke at the trial of us Greenham women in 1993 at Bow Street Magistrates Court. So I'm nearly done, but there are just 2 more points really that I want to raise. I will send some of these notes through to Alan and LABRATS with links where you can find out more from what's known as the Native Community Action Council of the Western Shoshone. It's a traditional organisation to highlight the environmental, social justice and treaty demands of the Western Shoshone Nation. Also about Yucca Mountain, where the US government is trying to set up a huge nuclear waste facility, again completely in violation of the Ruby Valley Treaty of 1863. in violation of the rights and the health and environment of the Western Shoshone people, and it's within the boundaries of what they call the Nevada test site, and also links to more information relating to the Western Shoshone and all the struggles that they've had. So finally, I just come to two recommendations that I have included in the recent report, or that I'm including in the revised version of the report that I did for CND that is about to be printed. So I had a bit of time to revise. I've added two key recommendations in consultation, both with LABRATS and with a small group of us in ICANN and also in responsibility and communication with the Western Shoshone. One of these is saying all governments that have not already done so should lay the groundwork to join and implement the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and pending adherence, NPT parties, which includes the UK, must take urgent steps to comply fully with existing NPT disarmament and non-proliferation commitments and attend the TPNW meetings of states parties. We call for both the Westminster and Scottish Parliaments to undertake separate investigations and studies to determine what would be entailed in joining the TPNW, and obviously that includes the responsibilities under Articles 6 and 7 for the assistance to victims or survivors, as we refer to them, of nuclear testing as well as nuclear use, and also production, and obviously waste comes into this issue too, we believe, and the importance also of civil society and cities in pushing for that. But these two key ones, which I think are in harmony also very much with what LABRATS is calling for, which is that the UK needs to declassify all its archives, studies and documentation on Britain's nuclear weapons testing and production programs, including any studies relating to accidents, any environmental or health impacts arising from such programs and activities. And then secondly, of these two, the UK should recognise the rights of indigenous and local peoples. Now that's important here because a lot of the impact of the fallout from the nuclear testing on Western Shoshone land and from the Nevada test site actually went into Utah, to the communities, villages such as St. George, going right up through the whole swathe of Utah and into South Dakota and North Dakota, where actually I had my early life in North Dakota as part of the Huttite community, and indeed have the thyroid problems that they talk about, that seem to have a high incidence of relations with fallout from nuclear testing. So this says that it should recognise the rights of indigenous and local peoples, civilian and service personnel, whose health and environments have been affected by British nuclear weapons testing, production and related activities, and ensure full cooperation and assistance to address such impacts and provide redress, health support and environmental remediation as necessary. So I'll leave that there, but happy to take any questions, and I can stay online if you want to call me back in.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I'm sure there'll be questions which I will pass on to you. Rebecca, can I just say, on behalf of LABRATS and everybody here, your dedication over many, many years to this cause is absolutely outstanding. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me to come and join you, even if from a bit of a distance.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.